Hello. On this chapter, we will talk about the lymphatic system and lymphoid organs and tissues. Remember how some time ago we noticed how all body systems were linked together, and this is the case also here. It is especially the cardiovascular system and the circulatory part of it, so the blood vessels, that have a significant amount of overlap with the lymphatic and immune system. Therefore, it is a natural place here for us to tackle this system. And the clinical relevance for us is, of course, the lymph nodes. It is one of the first tests that the doctor does when you go in with a complaint of feeling sick, having a cold, and so on. The doctor will likely test your lymph nodes and evaluate whether they are abnormal size and if they are sensitive. This would be a sign of an infection, and to evaluate this, you would need to, of course, know the normal anatomy and physiology. So, let's get started. So, I think that we should start by discussing what is it that lymphatic system really aims to do. That would be a good start, right? But to understand this, we will take a step a bit further back. Remember, in our unit of cardiovascular system, we talked about capillaries being the sites of exchange of materials. These very small vessels had a very thin wall so that this exchange would be very efficient. And remember also that we had two pressures acting here. Hydrostatic pressure, which pushed outwards from the vessel, and osmotic pressure, which was the force pushing back into the vessel. Let's look at this a little more. So here we see these two forces working on a level of capillary microcirculation. And if you remember that a human circulatory system passed through some 20 liters of blood each day, you will note that this all has to pass through this area. And we say that it is capillary filtration that happens here. This term refers to the movement of fluids across the capillary membranes. And you might have heard about the term plasma. It is plasma that moves through these capillaries into a space outside them and outside the cells. This is now in this space outside the vascular system that we just talked about in regards to the blood vessels. And what is interesting to me is looking at the numbers. So let's do just that. In a day, about 20 liters of plasma leaks out. Please note that I use the term leak very loosely here. It is meant to leave the capillaries into this space outside the vasculature. And 70 liters of this is reabsorbed back to the blood vessels. So a simple math exercise shows us that remaining 3 liters become now to this interstitial fluid. And it is this 3 liters of fluid that the lymphatic system deals with, picking it up from this space, taking it to the lymphatic vessel, and returning back to the cardiovascular system's blood vessels. So, we have now seen a couple of terms that I want to be sure that we are certain about. First, we have blood in the vasculature of the cardiovascular system. This traveled to the capillaries, and once it escaped outside them, it became interstitial fluid. And this 3 liters of net gain of fluid that is left outside, it becomes lymph. But when does it become lymph? Well, the answer is when it enters the lymphatic system through entering lymphatic vessel. Well, back to this slide. What I want to do next is to discuss why we should tackle the lymphatic and immune systems together. Let's have a look at that. So, lymphatic system and immune system are linked as lymphoid organs and tissues provide the structures for the immune system to work in. Immune system's phagocytic cells and lymphocytes are housed within the lymphatic system structures. And the last thing for us to do is to consider the different parts of the lymphatic system. So we will cover the network of lymphatic vessels, the fluid in these vessels known as lymph, and the lymph nodes, these clean the lymph. So that sounds like a good plan of action for me for this chapter. So you might remember a diagram that is similar to this from our discussion of the cardiovascular system. Here we see a representation of that. Note how it is a closed loop where the blood can travel only to one direction. And it was at the site of the capillaries where some of the content sneaked out and some of it was recovered, and the remaining part became interstitial fluid. Now this interstitial fluid needs to be picked up by the lymphatic system, so let's add it to the diagram. And here we have the lymphatic system added to this diagram. You might notice how it is open from one end, the end where it picks up the interstitial fluid around the blood capillaries. So this is not a closed loop system like blood circulation, but rather an open one. And another thing to note is that it dumps its contents that it carries, and this was lymph, back to the cardiovascular system just before the heart. And finally, please note that this system as well is unidirectional. So lymph can only travel to one direction in it. So there we have a rather nice comparison of the lymphatic system and cardiovascular system. Now let's look in a little more detail the lymphatic vessels. So just like we had in blood vessels, there are different sized lymphatic vessels. And also note the order in which I'm presenting these. This is no coincidence. We always discuss these, like the blood vessels, in the order of the flow of the content in them. So, lymphatic capillaries are located in a space between the blood vessels' capillaries and the cells that make tissues of that area. If you compare them to the blood capillaries, they have largely similar structure, but the big thing here is that they are more permeable. And another thing that will be important for us is that they can take in much larger elements than the blood capillaries. This can be both good and bad. Many large proteins are able to cross into the body this way. And we talk about the role of lymphatic system in absorbing these from a nutritional standpoint in a later module. And also cell fragments get taken up to the cardiocirculatory system, then transported in this way. Where this becomes problematic, though, is, for example, that if we try to remove a cancerous tumor and some of these cancer cells get into the lymphatic system, they can spread throughout the entire body. So this is why some prefer treatment options where the growth is not cut into. And of course, another example of a problem is when pathogens manage to enter the lymphatic system and then can use it as a route to spread to almost all parts of the body. Well, lymphatic capillaries then drain into larger lymphatic vessels. And these are increasingly larger and are known as collecting lymphatic vessels. And again, we have the same order of structures as in blood vessels. Collecting vessels, trunks, and ducts. In these, we have structures that resemble those on veins of the blood vessels. The big difference is that there are much more valves and connections to other lymphatic vessels, though. So let's have a look at some lymphatic vessels in situ. What we see here is a view inside the thoracic cavity. And just to give us some anatomical landmarks that we are probably familiar with, let's note that we see here esophagus and trachea. So our tubes taking the food to the stomach behind the windpipe. And based on what we just learned about the cardiovascular system, we might note superior and inferior vena cava. So these major veins bringing blood into the heart. And on this, both these vessels and the trachea and esophagus are cut to allow us to see the structures more strikingly. The ones that I want to highlight, especially regarding our lymphatic system, are the thoracic duct, which we will talk a bit more in a little bit, and structure called cisternaculi. This is dilated sac at the lower end of the thoracic duct, so a rather nice anatomical landmark. So let's return back to this review of different types of lymphatic vessels that we might have, and I want us to this time focus on lymphatic trunks. And what I have for us next here is a very nice diagram, so let's study it in a little more detail. But first I want to remind us that lymphatic trunks are larger than the structures that we have just looked earlier. These are formed by vessels joining together. And here is where this diagram comes useful for us. These trunks are named based on body region. So we have lumbar region at the lower part of the back, and intestinal trunk at the intestines. Remember term intercostal? Well, intercostal trunks are located between the ribs. Now, let's look at bronchomediastinal lymphatic trunk. That is quite a mouthful of a term, but if we break it down, we will see that the name actually tells us where this term refers to the trunks at the bronchi and mediastinum. A few more that I want to mention. Subclavian trunk is below clavicle, so below our collarbone if you wish. And finally, jugular trunk. Well, this is at the level of neck and throat. So I think that this is quite a nice diagram for us to have had a look. Now, let's move on to the lymphatic ducts. These are even larger in size. And we will have a look of two important ones. First, right lymphatic duct. This drains right arm and right side of the head and thorax, and it empties to the right subclavian vein. And then we have thoracic duct, which we talked earlier on about a bit. You might remember this figure that we saw earlier, and I promise to get back to it. So thoracic duct drains the remaining parts of the body and it empties into the left subclavian. I think that we should talk a little bit about clinical relevance here, so I wanted to introduce a term lymphedema. And this is when there is too much lymph building up and it is not drained as it should be. And some examples of causes include tumors blocking the lymphatic vessels or removal of lymphatic vessels during cancer surgery. And the future outcome may not be that gloomy if some lymphatic pathway have remained on the area and if they end up enlarging to compensate for this. Let's have a look of some examples of it. So if you look at these examples, you will see that there is significant amount of swelling only on one side. And this swelling is due to the lymphatic drainage being compromised on this area. So lymph builds up. And before we wrap up this video, I think that we could address a few other points. And the first one is something that I think that we have not yet covered properly and is very important. We have not really talked about what the lymph is made of. Well, lymph contains all of these, with, of course, water being where all others are dissolved in. And then we have proteins and white blood cells, of course. One thing to note here is that there should not be any red blood cells in lymph. And where is lymph produced then? Well, at the bone marrow and lymph nodes. And we will have a look of the lymph nodes, especially in a little more detail in the next video. Finally, let's look at the lymphoid cells in a little more detail. So lymphoid cells consist of immune system cells, which are found in lymphoid tissue, and supporting cells that form lymphoid tissue structures. Let's start with the immune system cells. Well, these are known as lymphocytes and are cells of the adaptive immune system, which then mature into one of the two main types, T cells, which are T lymphocytes, and B cells, which are B lymphocytes. Both T and B cells protect us against anything that body may perceive as foreign. And if we want to have a look of a little more detail, T cells manage immune response, and some of these also attach and destroy infected cells, while B cells produce plasma cells which secrete antibodies. And these antibodies mark antigens for destruction. And we can also have other lymphoid immune cells, such as macrophages and dendritic cells. Then, let's say just a few words about the supporting lymphoid cells. Well, reticular cells produce reticular fibers called stroma in lymphoid organs. There are a network-like support that acts as scaffolding for immune systems. And you can see a good example of this in the figure that I have provided. So, that's it for our first video of the lymphatic system. We will continue in the next one by looking a little more about lymphatic tissues.